Virginia Center for Politics.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Ken Stroupe, the Associate Director of the UVA Center for Politics, and we're recording this on Wednesday, February 17th, 2021. On January 6th, when we launched the University of Virginia's first Democracy Dialogues, the center's director, Larry Sabato, announced that over the coming year, the Center for Politics would launch a new civility project aimed at lowering the temperature in politics by focusing on what unites Americans of goodwill rather than what divides us. Now, admittedly, this won't be an easy endeavor, and we certainly can't do it alone. We've been working on a number of local, state, and national partnerships that will be unrolling in the programs over the coming months and over the coming year. And we certainly invite and encourage your participation and advice. Some of that is coming in already, and we welcome that to continue. You can learn more about the Civility Project by visiting our website at centerforpolitics.org. And while you're there, be sure to sign up for our weekly newsletter, Sabato's Crystal Ball. And if you'd like to support these or other programs of the UVA Center for Politics, we invite you to text USA Votes to 41444, and you'll receive some additional information. Again, that's USA Votes. Just type in that phrase, and you text it to 41444. And you'll receive additional information on how you can support the center. It's not news that the country is divided politically. Our system is adversarial by design. But the events of January 6th underscore that hyperpartisanship and negative partisanship have reached levels that have already threatened the American Republic and may continue to do so unless there are concerted efforts by every American, again, of goodwill, to try to change this trajectory. As we kick off this series, we thought it important to take a look at the state of America's two major political parties and where they might be headed in the future. As the title Warring Factions suggests, it's unlikely that the Democratic or Republican partisans will ever view one another as best friends. But to always think of the other side as your worst enemy, who must be destroyed at any cost, is, as we've seen, harmful and dangerous for this country. And as we've seen in the news over the last 24 hours, the view that anyone who opposes you as your enemy is not only poisoning relationships among competing parties, but it's now threatening to create significant divisions within the parties themselves. What, if anything, can be done about it? Well, here to help us unpack all of this are four experienced guests. They are serving as visiting scholars at the Center for Politics with us this year, and they reflect a wide variety of perspectives. They have long and impressive resumes, and I can't begin to cover all of it here tonight, so I will apologize to them for the brevity of my introductions, but invite you to go to our website for more information. Tara Setmayer, she's not a stranger to any of you who follow our online programs. She's a CNN political commentator, ABC News political contributor, and former GOP communications director on Capitol Hill. And she is currently the host of Honestly Speaking with Tara, a podcast. Jamelle Bouie is a columnist for the New York Times and a political analyst for CBS News. He covers campaigns, elections, national affairs, and culture. He attended the University of Virginia, where he graduated with a degree in political and social thought and government. Chris Krebs, we welcome him as our newest addition to our resident scholars program. Chris served as the first director of the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, C-I-S-A. Chris was nominated for that position by former President Trump in February of 2018. And in case you haven't been watching the news over the last few months, he was also fired from that position in December after his agency stated that the 2020 presidential election was, in fact, a secure election. Chris is a UVA grad and also has his JD from the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University. And finally, it's my pleasure to introduce David Ramadan, who's spoken in a number of times to my classes in person. David is a seasoned executive and international consultant with 25 plus years of advocacy, business, and government relations experience. David served 2 terms in the Virginia House of Delegates from 2012 to 2016. He has a finesse for cultivating relationships and working across the aisle. Excuse me. David is an adjunct professor at George Mason University, and he immigrated to the United States from Lebanon in 1989 after attending the International College in Beirut. Welcome, everyone. My first question, I'd like to get a reaction from each of you, and I'll start with you, Jamelle, and then I'll go to Tara, Chris, and David. So in that order for the first question, and it's a very broad one. To what extent are parties still necessary today? What practical role do they play? And what role should they play? Jamelle, you first.
All right. Well, first, thank you for having me this evening. You know, it's weird to say that I am pro political party, but I think I would consider myself pro political party, not in terms of any specific party, but just in terms of what they mean for democracy. People will observe that there is no modern democracy that does not have political parties. And the United States, whose constitution doesn't really account for or include political parties in any of its structures, pretty quickly developed them in at least like a nascent form within a few years of its ratification. And within a generation, we had sort of what we recognize as modern style political parties. So I think that's significant, right? That political parties just emerge as part of any democratic system pretty quickly after its creation. And that's because political parties, I think, and this is why they're necessary, serve this vital function of, well, 2 vital functions. The first being kind of structuring political ambition for people who have it, right? So if you want to be an office holder, if you want to be engaged in the process of selecting candidates, if you want to be engaged in the process of building a platform, political parties provide the opportunity to do that, provide the pathways for doing that, help network and create the relationship necessary to make that happen. And then for voters, or for anyone who wants to get involved in politics, political parties basically act as a heuristic for how to actually cast a ballot. I'm sure people watching have had the experience of voting in a municipal election. It feels very difficult to figure out who you should vote for, especially if you haven't been paying a ton of attention. You step into the ballot booth, the ballot box, voting booth, whatever you want to call it, and you have to choose someone to be on the school board or to be, county commissioner or what have you. And it's not partisan election. And the only thing you really have to go off of is what knowledge you have about each individual. Parties basically let you kind of not have to exert that much energy. Person belongs to a party that tells you, the voter, something about where they stand, what they believe, what they might do in office. So even if you don't know that much specifically about the person, knowing their party helps you make a decision. And that is always going to be a vital part of democratic life. I don't think there's going to be, or at least electoral life, we're not going to be able to engage in ordinary electoral politics without political parties. And so they're going to, whatever form they the party changes, they're still going to be necessary, and they're still going to be how we actually do on a practical level democracy, at least when it comes to elections.
Thank you, Jamelle. Tara, your thoughts on the question?
So I think the idea of parties and debating their efficacy has been something that's an age-old debate from the beginning of the United States. When the founding fathers warned against factions, they were concerned about that. But to Jamelle's point, those, quote, factions began to develop relatively quickly in the nascent stages of the United States, and it was inevitable. It's just the way human nature is. You gravitate to people of like mind or of like political interest, and what that looks like for the last 150 years or so has been a two-party system. I think what we've seen over the last 5, 6, 7 years is that the amount of tribalism, maybe even longer, I would say maybe a decade, but the amount of tribalism that we've seen in the party divisions has become alarming. The idea of negative partisanship, where you, to Jamelle's point, where people just vote down ballot whatever their party is. It doesn't make them, think too hard about it. They're not voting by candidate or issue for some folks. It's just party affiliation, and I'm voting against those other guys. I think we've seen that spiral out of control, particularly over the course of the last administration and where we are now. And so, political parties, the purpose of them was to win and consolidate power. They're a mechanism to express your political agency. But I think the conversation now in this country about whether we should have a third party, the American people are less and less identifying with parties on the left and the right. More people, the fastest growing group is unaffiliated, which I have joined recently after I left the Republican Party officially after 27 years, the day after the election this year. But that's happening all over the country. And we're seeing discussions at a state and local level about third parties, independents. I don't think we've seen that in a long time since the Republican Party split and became the Whigs, from the Whigs and became the Republican Party. So I'm happy to see this national conversation happening because something has to change. The course that the country has been on is not one that I think is good for our representative democracy. It's not good for accountability. And what we saw with the acquittal, not once, but twice, of Donald Trump for clear violations of the Constitution and the reasons given for it show even more that there has to be another way for voters to feel that they're being represented properly in Congress. So I think there's a lot of discussion to be had, and I'm glad that those discussions are happening about the efficacy of not only the current party structure, but also the discussions of possibly third parties or independents and ballot access and all the things that go along with that, because clearly the American people are not happy with the system we have right now, the party system.
Yeah, thank you, Tara. We'll get to some more of those details that you raised in your response in our next question. Chris, your thoughts, but I'm also interested because of what you've gone through. To what extent do you think partisanship is actually spilling over into governance, or were there other factors that created your situation?
Yeah, thanks, Ken, and thank you to Larry and UVA. It's good to be back. I think Tara and Jamelle hit some really interesting points that we could explore a little bit deeper. One of the things that's really struck me over the last several years is, to the tribalism point, the consolidation of political power, particularly in the Congress at the leadership ranks, has almost disenfranchised the rank and file members. And, with some spare time on their hands, what do? They run immediately to the sticks after briefings. They spend a lot of time in front of the camera. And so if they can't actually contribute to the political process, then they turn into a bit of more of a performative politics player. And I think that really that creates less than helpful environments, and that allows for a lot of the misinformation and the disinformation that we've seen over the last several years, but particularly the last year, to go mainstream, and particularly in some of the networks. And that is one of the things that I think we've got to kind of do a little bit of root cause analysis here of why is it like that? Is it the leadership ranks? Is it the caliber of candidate coming in? There's a separate piece to your governance point that I think bears a little bit of additional analysis as well, and that's the role of politics in the actual administration of elections. So we talk about when you go and you vote for a county commissioner, or in Texas for a judge or whatever. Sometimes they're not affiliated, sometimes they're not political, are affiliated with a political party. But what you find is the majority of the secretaries of state that actually administer elections across the country are independently elected. They're political affiliated. And that, in my view, if left unchecked or with the appropriate type of engagement, can lead to some less than ideal political outcomes. You look at what happened today in the state of Georgia with the Senate, for instance, the state Senate passing some laws that would actually restrict access to the ballot box. So, to me, we're going down the wrong track. I think democracy should be based on access, and it seems to me that we're not heading towards more access. In fact, we're heading the other way.
Thank you, Chris. David, I think you are the only one among us who's actually been elected to public office. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the question generally, but also how do you think the state of partisan politics has evolved and changed even since your time in the state legislature?
Thank you, Ken. Good to be with you. As much as I enjoy the comfort of doing this virtually, I miss being on the beautiful UVA campus as I have done before. Political parties remain to be essential in my mind. There's always the good and the bad, and the fellow panelists talked about some of the issues with today's parties. We can get more and deeper on all of those, and they're all correct points. But if we step back, there are really two important roles for parties. One is a vehicle, a mechanical setup that puts people on the ballot, not just the administration, as Chris just mentioned, but before even doing so, to get on a ballot, it's much easier to be part of a party to get on a ballot anywhere in the United States versus doing it on your own, trying to get signatures on your own and not having that vehicle to get on a ballot. Two, parties, when they're functioning properly, will have a platform of ideas and concepts that like-minded people have agreed upon, and that gauges and keeps their candidates and their nominees and then their elected officials within those boundaries of these thoughts and ideas that they all had agreed on. Now, that works assuming that those parties are functioning properly, that they did not go away, and that we didn't get the populist candidate that took over, like we've seen recently, and where my old party, the GOP, had even bypassed totally having a platform last year. I mean, this is the first time that I can find in our recent history where a major political party simply said, "Oh, we're not even going to have a platform. The platform is one person." And then they fixed that later and said, "Oh, we'll just take the platform from 4 years ago." This running away from the traditional role of the party when it's taken over is what created that partisan politics, that partisanship that you mentioned, Ken, that had gone beyond and above. We used to take pleasure and pride in Mr. Jefferson's capital in Richmond to talk about the bipartisanships that we had and differentiate ourselves in Richmond from across the river in Washington, D.C., because Washington, D.C. has gone way too partisan over the last couple of decades, where members of the House and the Senate don't talk, don't know each other. They don't debate anymore. I mean, the most deliberative body on earth, the United States Senate. When did you really watch a real debate in our recent history? You don't see it anymore. We still had that in Richmond to a certain extent. However, we also saw a little more of that partisanship carry over in the last few years from DC to Richmond, and infected, I would say, our local politics with that of the national partisanship, and that is a problem. So those sides of parties where it becomes about partisanship and a winner takes all, a zero-sum game, is the bad part that we have reached, not necessarily the existence of political parties, which I believe are still essential and needed in our society. And as Jamelle said in the beginning, they're part and parcel of democracy.
Thank you, David. Let me turn now to a timely issue, and I'm going to ask first David and Tara to respond to this, but if Jamelle or Chris, if you want to respond, you're welcome as well. But one timely issue that's getting a lot of attention today, I'm sure you've seen the statement that former President Trump issued yesterday about Mitch McConnell. It's certainly no surprise that he fired back, but as he lashed out at the senator, as I read it, he also seemed to be lashing out at the Republican Party generally. He said, and I'm quoting him now, quote, "The Republican Party can never again be respected or strong with political leaders," he puts leaders in quotes, like Senator Mitch McConnell at the helm. He made repeated references, President Trump did, to the Republican Party in a way that suggested, at least to me again, that he was suggesting that he's not a part of it. He's certainly suggested many times that he wants to launch a third party. And I think this statement is yet another one that seems to be laying the groundwork for that. Do you think this is likely? And if so, what odds do you give it for success, and what will be necessary for it to succeed? What's the platform, and how does it differ from the GOP? David, if you want to start, and then Tara.
Sure. First of all, let's make sure that we describe it correctly. That was not a statement. It was an old man that's just spewing some hate and xenophobia and attacks and in the form of a statement. Mitch McConnell was a leader before Trump even played in politics, remains to be a leader in the party after Trump. Donald Trump was not a Republican. That is, you're right on that. He was not a Republican. He did a hostile takeover of the GOP for 4 years, and now he finds himself out again. He is a representative of a period of fear that works in the short term, worked for a little bit, but now we're seeing what's coming out of it. He will continue to have some influence over the party because of $400 million that he pocketed after the elections in his PAC, and because of that element of fear and populism that he created. But I think the party survives him, and that's what he's not getting, and that's what's getting to him, is that the party will survive him. The Mitch McConnell of the world will survive him, whether to take a 4-year cycle. We've seen these movements coming in before, but there's new and elements of hope. There are the few and the brave today, right? We were seeing the Kissingers and the Herrera Butler and Ben Sass and Liz Cheney, and even on state level, Chris Sununu, and these are conservatives that I hope and believe we will that have the guts, to watch our language here too. They have the guts to continue this fight and survive this Trumpism movement. And that's something that is hard to understand for Donald Trump, who doesn't belong. We're talking about platform a minute ago. Who doesn't understand? He doesn't stand for anything. He stands for what works for Trump the day off. And that's not traditional of any party. Will he create a third party and go on? I doubt it, because that will actually shrink his immediate influence, and immediate could be, again, a year or two or three, versus giving him leverage and power over an existing establishment that exists today. Would it be good for democracy if he does? I think it would. It could be good for the GOP for sure, if he takes that element with him and he leaves. And it may even be good for America, because then we can go back to two parties that can truly debate ideas and compete on ideas versus this hate and fear that exists today.
Tara, your thoughts? Do you think it's good for the GOP if Trump were to break away from it?
Well, I mean, I think that the Republican Party is, as we've known it before Trump, is dead, and it needs to be burned to the ground and start over if there's any chance of surviving anything that resembles a Republican Party in the more traditional establishment sense. The party has turned into a cult of personality. To Chris's point, the term performative politics, I will be using that moving forward. I think that's an excellent description of what we've seen go on here. To David's point, there's been no platform for the Republican Party for several years. It's been to pledge fealty and bow a knee to the altar of Donald Trump for the last 5 years. And even when there were opportunities for the Republican Party to come back from that and take that exit ramp to step away from Donald Trump and exercise the party of Trumpism, they have not taken them. It was after the election when he claimed that there was election fraud, which was a big lie, and attacked our democratic and undermined our democratic system. They didn't do that. They let him rant and rave and perpetuate this propaganda lie that ultimately resulted in a violent and deadly insurrection on January 6th because of this big lie. They had an opportunity to step away from him after the insurrection. People died. Police officers were maimed. The vice president was in harm's way. They were looking to assassinate members of Congress, including his own vice president. They did not step away then as a party. They had a few, only 10 out of 200 roughly, had the courage to stand on principle and do what's right after a president who was part of their party incited a violent insurrection. It doesn't get any more high crimes and misdemeanor than that. They had another opportunity to impeach him based off of this, and Democrats made an excellent case, and they hid behind process arguments, which was just political cowardice. They knew that Donald Trump was guilty. They knew that they had the opportunity at that moment right then to say enough is enough with this, but they did not. Only a handful made the decision to choose their country and their oaths of office over the cult of Donald Trump. So does the Republican Party survive this way? No. There is a civil war brewing inside the party. And I've been part of many conversations with other factions within the conservative movement about what to do. A faction within the party and build that up so that you can run candidates that can challenge these Trumpist Republicans. Do we start a new party? Is there money for ballot access? There's a lot of conversations about this, but I will tell you that the conversation about the fact that there are 25% in the most recent poll I saw of Republicans that think the party should not continue to support Donald Trump shows that there is at least an opening. But the fact that 75% of current Republicans still back Donald Trump and think that he can still be the titular head of the party is alarming. You can't. What do they stand for? They have no platform. They have no beliefs other than populist nationalism, which is dangerous. Misinformation. Trump has never been a Republican, to David's point. He just used the Republican Party. He has no core beliefs. And when you hear people chanting destroy the GOP at his rallies, that's exactly what they're going to do. Mitch McConnell claims now that he's done with Donald Trump, but he didn't have the courage to vote for impeachment and be done with him. So now he says he's focused on 2022 in the midterms and getting the Senate back. Well, he's going to have to contend with the civil war inside the Republican Party and also at the state level. We're seeing those factions at the state level. So I don't see how the party survives in its current form unless those factions like the Kinsingers and the Liz Cheneys have more support and that they find others to join them where their political power can be consolidated and they can make a difference at the ballot box. Other than that, you're going to see the Republican Party destroy itself.
Jamelle and Chris, some say that might be what Donald Trump is looking for. If he does, in fact, break away and forms a third party, can the GOP, the Republican Party as we know it today, be successful without Trump and Trump's followers?
I mean, yeah, if Donald Trump were to break away and form a third party, given the extent to which so many rank and file Republicans, not just sort of in the grassroots, but also state and local Republican politicians and officials, given the extent to which they really do see themselves as members of a party led by Donald Trump, if Trump were to leave the Republican Party, I think you'd be left with the Republican Party that's more or less like a rump party, right? There wouldn't really be much there. And I don't think that party could be very successful. The dilemma for never Trump or anti-Trump Republicans within the Republican Party, such that they're there, is that they can't win without the Trumpy Republicans. They can't win elections. Just on a basic level of numbers, right? In a first past the post electoral system, if there are two major factions and one faction is splitting the vote between two parties, then they're never going to get to the plurality or the majority they'll need to win the seat. There's no sharing of power. There's no proportional representation. They just will lose. And so the reason why someone like Mitt Romney is never going to leave the Republican Party under the current conditions is just that he wants to win elections. And at the end of the day, you need the Trumpy Republicans to win. And really vice versa, they need the not so Trumpy Republicans, the Trumpy Republicans. They need them to win too. If they lose 5 or 10% of their voter base in a competitive election, that's the ball game. They can't win. And so I don't think there's any way for any kind of, given the current system, right? We're kind of assuming all the rules of the game are the same. You change the rules of the game, if all of a sudden you have ranked choice voting or you have proportional representation in the House or something. I mean, there are plenty of people who have thought a lot about how you would introduce a viable multi-party system into the United States. If you change those rules, then everything's different. But assuming the rules are what they've been, a Republican Party without Trump supporters or without Trump and presumably a large portion of his supporters is not going to be able to be successful. And a Trump party without those more traditional Republicans is not going to be very successful. Unfortunately, I think for the never Trump Republicans, the momentum in the party really is with Donald Trump and those who want to follow his lead. You just look at the presidential aspirants right now, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, Ron DeSantis in Florida, Kristi Noem, who in South Dakota, the governor there. You look at the people who are clearly interested in making a run for the White House, Mike Pence, even still, and they're not walking away from Trump or trying to put any distance between themselves and him. They are, if anything, trying to find what part of his political persona, what part of his political style they can use to win votes. And that to me is the clearest indication that, to the extent that there's a civil war within the Republican Party, it's already over. It's been won. The Trump Republicans won it, and it's all just negotiated surrender for everyone else. And the direction the party's going in is the one that Trump forged for it. Will this be electorally successful? Open question. I don't know. Will a Republican candidate in 2024 be able to if it's a non-Trump that's the nominee, will they be able to replicate some of what Trump did in these last two elections? I don't know. But I think those are the questions that I think are worth talking about asking, given that we're likely not gonna see a major change to the actual system of elections in the United States, which would be the thing you would need to have a viable third party. Because I do think that if you just look at the Republican and Democratic coalitions as they're currently constituted, there are clear divisions that you could imagine a multi-party system kind of developing out of that, right? But within both parties, but the rules and the structures don't really provide an incentive for the parties to consciously uncouple the various coalitions.
Tara, I see you were shaking your head. Chris, I want to get your thoughts on it, but Tara, while it's still fresh in your mind, you seem to be disagreeing with Jamelle for part of that answer.
No. I agree with him in that there are presidential aspirants that are looking to stick with Donald Trump's form of the Republican Party versus trying to separate themselves because they're just reacting to the numbers in the primary, to the base. And you forgot one of them, Jamelle, which was Josh Hawley, who has been part of the seditionist senators who went along with the insurrection talk and perpetuating the big lie and trying to vote against, challenge Joe Biden's election. I mean, these are inconceivable positions for anyone who's been a Republican prior to 2010. I mean, you could never imagine. You couldn't get any farther away from the party of Lincoln. So I think that to Jamelle's point also, it is very difficult to break away from the current mechanism and with ballot access and third parties and things like that. It makes it really difficult to have a new party. I don't know that a multiple party system works yet in this country. There would have to be a lot of structural changes to get there and a lot of money behind it. But my point earlier was that, the last poll I saw was Gallup in end of January that showed 50% of the American people are independents. That's the highest number since they started polling that in 2004. And I would suspect probably in the last 50 years. There is room for this, that the American people want something. So I wasn't really necessarily disagreeing with Jamelle. I was only worrying that he did not mention Josh Hawley, whose behavior has been beyond abhorrent, but clearly based on his presidential aspirations. And I don't quite know how he runs on a seditionist party platform at that point.
And
Chris, it makes a lot of sense. This notion that if you're taking half and then you're splitting it in half or whatever percentage, that it makes it really hard for whatever that faction is of Trump supporters who may or may not break away from the party. If there is a split in the GOP, the numbers suggest that only favors the Democratic Party.
I think that's probably right. A couple points based on the prior conversation. First, Jamelle, that was horrifying. Your lecture. It really is a stark view of the political landscape. And so, first point, I think, is that a three-year multi-party structure just isn't going to work. I think most Americans, if you've been playing around in DC long enough, you realize that everything's binary, that you can't hold three separate nuanced ideas in discourse at any given time. And it just unfortunately breaks down to, yes, no, right, left, whatever it is. Look at what's happening in Texas right now. We have a failed energy infrastructure down there. And then all of a sudden it gets turned into some, despotic manifestation of the Green New Deal, which actually has nothing to do with it, whether it's solar or wind power. It's just the fact that a market-driven, deregulated infrastructure is what won the day because of politics. The second point is that the current Republican Party, I think more than anything, is Trump is simply a symptom or a manifestation of something that's much greater. much graver. And to me, that is what's most concerning. What is it that Trump tapped into to develop this groundswell, at least in 2016, and then over the last couple of years? There was a daily back in New York Times Daily back in I think it was November, about, maybe it was over the summer, but nonetheless, this was about Lucerne County, Pennsylvania, and it seemed to have been, he really tapped into the left behind part of America, which is, overwhelmingly white. So what does that look like going forward? Can they keep that momentum up? Which I think goes then to the third point. Why did Trump lose this last election? And I think in part it's a demographic shift, but also a base of support shift. When you have white suburban voters, female voters in particular, abandoning the party because you're just so over the top. That tells me that, you can really crystallize what your message is and whip up some aspect of your base. But if the base is eroding over time, then you're going to have a longer term problem in terms of putting people in office. And so, any sort of prospects of 2022 recapturing the House, or 2022 and beyond recapturing the Senate, I think there's a lot of structural problems with that strategy.
David, you wanted to respond?
Yeah, I wanted to add that we really need to separate here between presidential election and then statewide and local elections, right? Jamelle is right that you probably cannot win as a Republican nominee if Trump and his base leave the Republican Party on the presidential level. But on every other level, I would contend that we can. Republicans can win congressional races without. If you get rid of that 20-25% that will, I assume, will go with Trump to a third party, you can gain back those numbers from the independents that may like the candidate, depending on who is the Republican candidate that's running at the time. And you can even get some of those voters that left the party, but they'd rather vote for a conservative versus voting for a Democrat. I think there is a chance of winning congressional races, winning senatorial races, certainly gubernatorial and state houses, which are very, very important, even for redistricting and on so many levels. If we have a party that is clean of the Trumpism element, and they will be competitive and they can build that way. Look, the Barbara Comstocks of the world. Barbara Comstock, a former visiting scholar here, Barbara won her district before Trump, lost it because of Trump, right? I ran a 60% Democrat district, and we both run, like Barbara did in her primary. She ran against a very hardcore right element, and they undercut her in the general. There are 10% of the vote that never voted for Barbara, right? There's 10% of Republicans that never voted for me in the general election because my last name is Ramadan. And that's fine. I still won without them. And I won in a 60% Democrat district. But it's harder, takes much more work. It needs a better candidates that can work together. It needs support system and dollars like what I think Mitch McConnell is trying to do here. But it's not impossible. And I still think would be the better solution for the Republican Party and the better forecast is if that Trump element leaves it versus stays in. Otherwise, it's going to be dead, like Tara said. It's going to be done.
Thank you, David. Chris.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that, but I just, some of the trend lines we're seeing out there in statewide are pretty disconcerting. You look at what's happening with all the senators that voted to convict in their state level GOPs. They're censuring them. Richard Burr. You're seeing Toomey up in Pennsylvania, and it's actually kind of going the other way as well in Ohio, where Anthony Gonzalez voted to impeach. He has not been censured yet. Therefore, the state GOP chairwoman is getting pressure. So it'd be surprising if he wasn't censured in the next couple of weeks. And then you look at Josh Mandel, who announced, the former treasurer of the state, announced that he was going to run for Senate. And he'll very likely get that, get the nomination, at least from the political or the GOP. But he's running on a Trump platform. So I think, I think there's still, again, a lot of structural challenges built in, not just to a multi-party approach, but just the long shadow or hangover, whatever you want to call it, of Trump.
Jamelle, if you will hold that comment, I'm going to try to summarize and move on to the next topic, but you're certainly welcome. I think someone from Cincinnati has tweeted an interesting question that I want to try to summarize because we are talking about warring factions, and that doesn't mean just warring factions within the Republican Party. We also want to talk about the Democratic. There are reports today that key Democrats, namely Majority Leader Schumer and Senator Warren, are unhappy with President Biden's reluctance to cancel $50,000 in student debt. I doubt that issue alone poses any significant problems for the Democrats, but are you concerned about a more widespread split on big ticket liberal proposals? And how long can the honeymoon last for President Biden? Where are conservative policies headed during the Biden administration, and which conservative policies, if any, are most likely to pass under Biden? There are a lot of questions in there, but Jamelle, if you want to take a first crack at it, then Tara, and then fling it open to anyone.
Sure. Yeah. No. So there's obviously a divide within the Democratic Party. I think, in the same way that the divide within the Republican Party, it's sort of oversimplifying things to just make it Trump, non-Trump. It's oversimplifying things, I think, as well, to make the divide in the Democratic Party between progressives and centrist progressives and center left Democrats. There's sort of competing theories of change at hand. There's the kind of simple fact that different, especially in the Senate, different senators have different constituencies, and the Democratic Party is much more reliant on maintaining a large the coherence of a large diverse coalition. And I don't just mean diverse in terms of race, but I mean diverse in terms of religion and geography. The constituency that elects Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema is very different than the one that elects the senators here in Virginia, for example, Tim Kaine and Mark Warner. And so having to juggle all that is just going to be inherent difficulty for party leaders. But there is a divide. I think the $50,000 student loan forgiveness battle is sort of illustrative of some elements of that divide. Warren and Schumer have a constituency that's probably a little more college educated than the median, and so they have sort of direct pressure from their constituents. And then Warren in particular represents a more progressive faction of the Democratic Party, one that isn't so attached to some of the policy approaches of Democrats past, and that doesn't want to shy away from big ambitious policies in a way that might make a Manchin nervous. And so if you're Biden and you in order to do anything, you have to hold together 50 Democrats at least, I think you're going to hedge towards, and that, generates tension within the coalition, and it has to be managed. And it'll be interesting to see how it ends up being managed. My hunch is that what we're going to see consistently is the Biden White House under promising and attempting to over deliver, right? Sort of not shying away from making big commitments to something, but then endorsing something or trying to get past something that is still pretty ambitious. And so to use the student loan thing again, Biden doesn't want to do 50,000, but he has voiced support for Congress passing a bill to forgive $10,000 in student loan debt, which by the standards of a unilateral $50,000 forgiveness is pretty tame. But by the standards of just how the federal government has approached student loans, period, over the last 20 years, is a huge change, right? Like if a candidate had proposed that 5 years ago in the campaign for president, I'm gonna urge Congress to forgive $10,000 in loans. We would understand that as being a big shift, and I think that's the dynamic we're going to see with Biden, kind of pressing against the maximalist version of something, and then pushing or endorsing something that even still is pretty pretty progressive relative to past Democratic presidents. As far as conservative policy, I mean, my own view on this is that the biggest obstacle right now to conservative policy preferences being passed into law, such that they are, is the filibuster. Not because those laws are being filibustered, but because a supermajority requirement for legislation makes it not worthwhile to try to build 51, 52 vote coalitions. And so if it was a full majority Senate for legislation, I think you might see, for example, Democrats playing ball with Mitt Romney's child benefit proposal, right? That a lot of people on the left actually like quite a bit, and is a really, I think, innovative approach to the problem of child benefits and child poverty. But if you need 60 votes to do it, and Romney can't guarantee 9 Republicans to come along with them, then what's the point? Whereas if you only needed 51 votes, then you have room to play. And I think, I'll end my kind of digression here. But if you look at how Biden's nominees for executive branch positions are getting, supermajority votes for them are going through pretty easily. Some of this is just tradition, but I think we should think about the extent to which not having supermajority requirement incentivizes trying to find points of agreement and trying to sign on to something if it's already going to happen. If a bill's already going to get passed, if the votes are there, the 51 votes are there, the 50 votes are there, then I actually think there's a greater incentive to try to make your own contribution to the final package versus not.
Tara, I mean, what do you think is what's going to be the biggest disappointment for the most liberal progressive wing of the Democratic Party? Are they going to have successes? Or are they going to be these sort of watered down versions by necessity? Are the AOCs of Congress going to get any of what they want? Are the Bernie Sanders going to get anything of what they want? Can they get it in this type of environment?
I think eventually they will get small victories. Joe Biden wasn't elected to be a progressive president. He ran as a moderate. He understands the dynamics in his own party, and the progressives did not win. Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, they didn't win on their agenda. Joe Biden did. And I think that what we're seeing right now, you asked if the honeymoon period was over. I think it's over. They gave him, it's probably the shortest honeymoon in history. After impeachment, it was time to start governing because there are so many existential crises facing the country right now. And I think the progressives trying to put too much into a COVID package and pushing their favorite policies so soon up front is setting themselves up for failure later, because it's not showing goodwill in other areas that have to be addressed first. They know that Biden can't put in a $15 an hour, a federal minimum wage in the COVID relief package or in reconciliation, but they're putting it out there because it's red meat for their base. The same thing with the student loan forgiveness. I know that some people look at it as an economic necessity as part of the COVID relief package because so many people, myself included, are still under mountains of student debt many years after I've been out of college. But that is something that, those numbers that they're asking for, he can't just do that with the wave of, with his pen and his phone. And he knows that, but he's giving them at least some opportunity to go back to their constituents and say, we're fighting for you. What happens, though, when it comes to actual policy? I think they'll get some incremental wins at some point, but Biden can't do it at the expense of losing Republican votes or moderate Democratic votes when you have, to Jamelle's point, it's so close on larger issues. So could they, I think by canceling the Keystone Pipeline, some of the climate change language and Green New Deal things, that was throwing a bone to the progressives up front. I think that was perhaps a mistake to do it through executive order, but I think that was trying to establish some goodwill there. Some of the other, the progression of the $15 an hour. It just can't happen overnight. If and when they do push for that, it has to happen incrementally. And Biden has been open to that. So I think that there's some room for some policy wins, but it's we're seeing that already with AOC and Ayanna Pressley sniping at his heels, a little bit, pushing for what they want, but that's what they're supposed to do. Whether that's a successful legislative policy or not remains to be seen. Is there any common ground for Republicans? I think you asked that question before. Is there any policy that maybe conservatives may get under Biden? I would argue that there's no incentive for them to work with Joe Biden. The obstructionist strategy, not saying it's the right strategy, but the obstructionist strategy worked for Mitch McConnell and Senate Republicans during Barack Obama's tenure. They gained 1,000 seats locally, state and locally. They won the House and Senate back. It worked. And so clearly for the next 2 years, if Mitch McConnell's focus is it's so close now and in the House and the Senate, that it may not benefit them to get it, to try to get any policy wins at that point, because the policy of negative partisanship that I mentioned before seems to incentivize people. Now, the caveat here that's different than 2009, where obstructionism worked, is that COVID-19 requires there has to be a bipartisan approach to that. There has to be some semblance of bipartisan cooperation on this. People are suffering every single day. So maybe on infrastructure or something like that, that's economic based, where in the heartland, it creates jobs, and the unions and the populist wing of Republicans that used to be Democrats that are, that crossover that went from Obama Democrats to Trump Republicans. Maybe there's somewhere there. I mean, infrastructure has become the biggest joke in politics now. I think maybe there is an opportunity for an infrastructure week moving forward. We might actually get one. But I think that outside of something like that, depending on where senators, there's 20 Republican senators up for re-election, it's going to be all about whether it's to their advantage to work with the administration or not. But more than likely, it's usually not.
I can't believe we're almost out of time, and we have more questions that it would take us. We could go on for 3 or 4 hours, and we wouldn't be able to get up to all the questions that are coming in. Let me just try to wrap it up with thoughts from each of you, and we'll continue this conversation and many other related ones over the coming year as we roll out more of this civility challenge project. And I'll start with you, David, then Chris, and Tara, then Jamelle. So David, what are the biggest challenges facing Democrats and the biggest challenges facing the GOP as parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party?
Delivery, I think, for both of them stands today to be the biggest challenge. For Democrats, it's delivery from a governing point of view, because they are now in charge, and we've seen already tiptoeing on the teachers versus coming back to school versus the science. Do we need everybody to have their shots? That's happening in the past couple of days with the administration. In this lack of civility in today's politics, unfortunately, they're both going towards partisanship and obstructionism, and their biggest challenge is civility and delivery. Talking of civility here, and I hope that we would see them go back to this. Look, in Virginia, I served as a Republican. Some of my best friends are on the other side of the aisle. I'm going to invoke his name for a second here. I used to get up on the House floor and give a speech ripping into Governor McAuliffe. And as soon as I'm done, there's a text on my phone that'll come in and say, "Come by for a beer." And then I would pass a law that comes out of the House and the Senate, goes to his desk, and he would be vetoing it and about to put out a press statement saying how bad my law is. And right before he does so, Terry would text me and say, "Hey, I'm about to veto your bill and say some not so nice things about you. Come by for a beer. The keg is ready," right? And we'd go sit down, have a beer, and chat it out. And we continued, and we actually developed a friendship beyond just working in the House and the governor. We don't see that anymore. And civility becomes a challenge, and then delivery on their promises so that they can remain relevant is, I think, their biggest challenge.
Thank you, David. Chris, thoughts on one or both?
Well, thoughts on what David just said. Richmond and the House of Delegates sounds a lot more like Rugby Road than a place where serious politics happens, but sounds fun. Look, I think on the Republican side, it's really it's an identity issue. What is a party are they, and can they be successful in this post-Trump as president world? And I think for the Democrats, I think the biggest challenge is going to be managing expectations to Tara and Jamelle's point. Is this going to be a big legislative ticket that's got the kitchen sink in it with a bunch of poison pills? Or can you figure out what success looks like and just chip away, play some Washington Nationals baseball, singles and doubles, drive runs in? I think the unifying element around all of it, and the one area that they can probably work together on, is China. China, it's a different world than it was 4 years ago in the Obama administration. And I think the Democrats can look at it both from an economic advancement perspective as well as civil rights. And I think the Republicans are going to look at it from a national security as well as economic. And that is, it's an area for common cause.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like, Chris, that a lot of these security issues that you've been dealing with, if that can't bring people together, then it's hard to imagine them getting together on much else.
The world has changed just so dramatically in the last 4 years. Not necessarily because what people were doing then and what they're doing now, but the blinders have lifted off many of the eyes. And I kind of feel like in Shawshank Redemption, Andy Dufresne climbing through the sewer pipe, coming out the other end, and you just have this disassociation with everything else, and you just see things so much cleaner and clearer.
Tara, biggest challenges facing Democrats and Republicans?
Yeah, I think Chris is right about managing expectations for Democrats. That is, I think it also applies to Republicans, the idea of identity. What is the party going to stand for? Will they be able to coexist with Joe Biden's moderate politics and the progressive side? Will that hinder his ability to get, to govern? So I think that's the push and pull of where the party goes for Democrats. Do they, because the progressives were gaining momentum, and then Joe Biden gets elected for a number of reasons, and now, are they going to? What happens now? Which direction does the party go in? I think that's going to be their biggest challenge. For Republicans, they need to decide whether they're going to be a pro-democracy party or a pro-seditionist party. I mean, the ugly tenets of authoritarianism that are creeping up into the Republican Party, and now becoming a party of illiberalism, is something that those forces are coming to a head right now, and they're very dark forces. And they have to make that decision. Which side are they going to fall on? And I think that wrestling the party away from the malignancy of Trumpism is going to be their biggest challenge. And we're seeing that play out every single day and very, very loudly. And they have to decide, do they want to be adults in the room and govern and legislate for the people they represent? Or do they want to be petulant, performative politicians and worry about how many Twitter followers they have and appearances on Fox News? That's going to be the choice. And we're going to watch that play out in front of us every single day. And I worry about which side the party actually decides to come down on, if recent actions are any indication.
Tell us how you really feel, Tara.
Jamelle, bring us home.
I'll just focus on Democrats for this, since I've just been thinking a bit more about them lately. I think the Democratic Party, and specifically Senate Democrats, are going to have to really figure out whether or not they want to maximize this time they have to govern. Right now, there's an attempt to put lots of stuff into a reconciliation bill. But reconciliation is not the best process for passing laws. It sort of requires lawmakers to devise all sorts of, get around all sorts of rules to force the policies into the package. The way these things are supposed to work is that senators propose laws or bills. They're discussed and voted on in committee. They're discussed and voted on. They're discussed on the floor, and they go for a vote. And they either pass or they don't. And the big obstacle to anything approaching that kind of procedure is the filibuster. None of the big democracy reform stuff Biden has promised and many Democrats support is possible with the filibuster, the legislative filibuster intact. No supplemental, if this bill passes, no supplemental COVID-related legislation would be able to pass. No big climate legislation will be able to pass there. No immigration legislation. I mean, you start going down the list of things that aren't related directly to the budget, which means it can't be passed in the reconciliation. There's not 60 votes for them. There might be 51 votes, there might be 54 votes, but there's not 60. And so for me, I think Democrats need to really ask themselves, do we intend to use this time the best that we have, these 2 years, to govern? And if so, then the filibuster has to go. And to a point Chris made very early in the conversation, I think that moving in the direction of just a simple majority Senate might take some of the power away from leadership. And I wish we could have talked more about that, because I do think it's a serious problem in both chambers of Congress that the hold leadership has over the floor, the extent to which individual members are basically disempowered, I think contributes a great deal to dysfunction in Congress.
Well, you've given us a great idea for another program. Jamelle Bouie, Tara Setmayer, Chris Krebs, David Ramadan, we are proud to say that you are resident scholars with us here at the UVA Center for Politics. We're proud of your work. The students look forward to having you in class, and we look forward to our continued affiliation with you. Thank you. We've learned a lot, and we'll look forward to the next time we can all get together, and hopefully sometime this year we'll be able to do it in person.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you to our audience, and good night, everyone.
Thank you.